Well, welcome back to the Equip for Life podcast. We are here with Emily, Rebecca, and our favorite practically co-host of the Equip for Life podcast, Monica Snyder from Secular Pro-Life. We're very excited to have you back. I've still got episodes from a couple of years ago that we still need to put out, and everyone has been enjoying those episodes. So ironically, we're sort of going back and forth in time like a bit here, but that's okay because Monica had a couple of really great topics for us to discuss. I was like, yes, we have to talk about these. Let's talk about these as soon as we can. So Monica, welcome, and tell us about what we're talking about today. You wrote an awesome blog post, a really, really great blog post that we are going to be linking to and we are going to talk about.
Well, thank you. We are doing this episode now, even though we have unreleased episodes, because the unreleased episodes were about topics that what our team calls perennial. Like they're going to keep applying. Yeah. This episode is about something that's sort of evolving as we're talking about it, which is a particular line of argument from some pro-life groups and people about abortion pills and how they affect our wastewater and the environment. And that's kind of a newer argument. It's a way newer argument in the scheme of pro-life arguments, I would say. Yeah. And it's gaining more attention, I think, recently. And so we wanted to skip ahead and record and get this episode out while it's happening. So I wrote a blog post about it, and I will say I'm trying to get better about saying this publicly. I wrote it. I had a lot of help putting it together. Secular Pro-Life has in the last 2 years put together a research team. They are my buddies, and I check a lot of things against them, especially related to chemistry and biology and STEM stuff and also statistics. And so I had a lot of help putting it together. But yes, we put together this blog post to try to explain as precisely as we could why at Secular Pro-Life we think that the arguments that abortion pills are harming the environment or the wastewater are, first of all, probably not accurate. And secondly, having what I think are unintended potential effects on people that we really have a problem with, specifically people who experience miscarriage, which is something I feel very, very passionately about. Yeah. So we put together this blog post kind of, it's sort of broken into 4 parts. It's like, what do we think about embryonic and fetal remains going into wastewater in the environment? And then specifically Mifepristone, the one part of the abortion pill regimen going into the environment. So kind of trying to look at both of those arguments. Do we think that this is a concern? Why or why not? And separate question, how does the way we talk about this impact people who experience miscarriage that involves flushing the remains of their miscarried children, which is not something I have found as someone who has had 2 miscarriages, and I've done a lot of work talking about that within Secular Pro-Life's work. I think it's the great muted grief. I think it needs to be spoken of more generally, including in pro-life circles. I have found that most people, understandably, don't realize that this is a way that miscarriage can happen. I think they just haven't really thought about it, and I don't blame them because why would you? But it is very common for women to experience miscarriage outside of a medical setting, including early enough that they are passing remains in a toilet. And then what they do after that is a very, very emotionally fraught and complicated question in miscarriage and pregnancy loss communities. And this is all impacted by the way we talk about abortion pills in the wastewater, which is what initially got me interested in maybe writing more about it. So that's the overview. Yeah. I don't know. Where do you want to go from there?
Yeah. So I'm sure some of our listeners have heard this argument by now in the last couple of years. But for those that haven't, that this is like brand new to them, that they haven't read your article and they haven't ever heard any other pro-life groups talking about this, can you kind of help just explain a little bit more, do a little bit more table setting of what is this argument that some pro-life people, leaders, whatever, are making?
So the general idea is that, first of all, true fact, very important, the proportion of abortions happening via abortion pill has skyrocketed since starting in 2017 and just increasing more and more all of the time. So the number of abortion pills containing Mifepristone, that is, let me back up a little bit further just for basics, okay? Abortion pills basically are Mifepristone and Misoprostol. You take Mifepristone and it detaches the embryo from the uterine lining and it makes it impossible to get nutrients or oxygen anymore. And then you take Misoprostol to induce contractions. Okay. Those are the two main things. The proportion of abortions done by pill has skyrocketed enormously. There's way more abortion pills happening now than abortions by abortion pill happening now than there used to be. And in a great number of cases, I would think probably the majority of cases at this point, that is happening outside of a clinical setting, often in people's homes. And essentially, they pass the remains of their child as well as other related tissues into a toilet and flush it. And that also means their body is metabolizing Mifepristone, and that is also going into our wastewater. So the argument is, do we have a good grasp of the increasing amounts of Mifepristone going into our wastewater and what effects that could or could not have on the wastewater, on the environment, et cetera? And there are some pro-life organizations. There's kind of a couple different versions of the argument. I would say the most reasonable version of the argument is, the last time the FDA, the EPA, whoever really looked at this was before it was this prevalent, and they don't really know that this is okay, and they need to at least check. I think that's the most reasonable version of the argument. There are more intense versions of the arguments that say this is, definitely causing all these problems. Look at this study that they did of fish. I can talk about that more if you want. And
now that you brought it up, I'm curious.
Essentially, okay, I have a chem bio background. I should have said that earlier.
Yeah.
All right. I did chemical biology at Berkeley, and then I did DNA analysis for my master's. All right. And one of the big things you have to understand, this goes for anyone who's chemophobic. You're like, what's the ingredients in the hot dog? Are you obsessed with Diet Coke? Right. The dose makes the poison. And what that means is something that could be benign or even helpful in small amounts could be dangerous in big amounts. And whether it's a poison or not is going to be contextual. Okay. And so they're saying, the dose is getting a lot higher. And did you guys really look at that when you first looked at this? And you should try it. But some are saying even stronger claims, which is we don't need to wait to figure out if this is a problem. We don't trust the institutions that are saying it's not, which, speaking as a political conservative, I'm very sympathetic to that. We need to pass legislation now requiring abortion pill providers to give catch kits to the women who are getting these pills and going home to collect the medical waste, they're calling it, the remains of their children and other tissues, and bring it back to a medical facility to be incinerated as medical waste instead of going into our environment. And they're arguing that this is necessary for the safety of the environment. And that's the more intense version of the claim, I think. And there is some activity, I think, on the federal level about reopening. Investigation is not the right word. It makes it sound like it's a criminal thing. Reopening research, looking at what does this mean now? Okay, so there's kind of different versions of it, but the general idea is there's way more abortion pills than there used to be. Mifepristone is going into the water more than it used to be. And we need to care about this for the sake of, yes, the children who are being aborted, but also as another effect, the environment, our wastewater. There's some that are saying things like we're drinking abortions. How will ingesting Mifepristone affect people who are trying to conceive? Like all this stuff that goes from, that's an interesting question, to you're terrifying people with very little basis. And I'm starting to be really uncomfortable now. So
So factually speaking, so let's focus a little bit on the Steelman versions for a little bit. So the FISH study. What is the FISH study that some people are pointing to that I guess would potentially show that there is too much of this in
so this
the water or the ground?
Misunderstanding. Speaking as someone who drinks a lot of Diet Coke, a lot. Okay. I have had many people over my adulthood be like, did you see this study on rats where they developed this cancer? And I'm like, yeah, I would have to attach a garden hose to my mouth every day to take as much aspartame as those rats took, okay? I get what you're saying, and I appreciate your concern, and this is why I'm not concerned. There's an equivalent here with Mifepristone. There's a FISH study. I can't remember the name of it right now, but I can get it to you later if you want.
We'll link to it.
It's being cited in a lot of the arguments about this, where they essentially exposed fish to Mifepristone and found really harmful effects. And my research team got me the actual study so I could look at the whole thing. I suspected and was correct that they were basically giving these fish the equivalent of, don't quote me on this, I'm giving you a ballpark, but it was something like if a woman took 2 abortion pills every day for a year or something like that. Okay. Right. And so that's what I mean by the dose makes the poison. Yeah, I believe you. I believe you that if you were just taking Mifepristone constantly every day for years, it could have risky effects. However, keep in mind that when we're talking about the wastewater, we're not talking about, even if you were just dumping abortion pills in the wastewater, even if you were doing that, okay, the water we're drinking, you have to ask how much of that is ending up in the water we're drinking. Is it 10%? Is it 0.001%? Is it like, what is it? The dose makes the poison in all discussions of chemicals, okay? So sure enough, yes, with the fish study, they found that if they gave them too much Mifepristone, it had harmful effects. That is true. So I don't know how much that plays out for this discussion.
Right. The best version of this would be to say that there is just so much Mifepristone in our water because insane levels of abortions are happening that it is like the fish study. It is really us attaching a garden hose of Mifepristone
how it's
to our mouth.
metabolized,
right?
What our waste treatment processes are. Like, just ignoring all of that and just assuming,
That's what I wanted to ask you. It's like, I remember the Magic School Bus episode that showed me how they did the water treatment stuff. There's a bunch of stuff that happens before it gets to the faucet, right? Like
there is. But steel manning,
okay, yes.
You don't remove everything in water treatment,
Okay.
Even there's things you care about removing and things you don't.
Yeah.
Even of the things you care about removing, you rarely get like 100% of it,
okay.
Yeah. We are not ever just drinking purely H2O.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So steel manning, I think it's like, well, this has gone up. Here's the strongest version of this argument, in my opinion. Abortion pills have gone up enormously. Our cultural institutions are totally corrupt, especially when it comes to abortion. How do we know that they even would care if, women everywhere are accidentally drinking low levels of Mifepristone? Would they even care? I don't think that's an insane thing to ask. But I think, and we could talk about this, that the most reasonable examination of what's going on is there's no reason to think that there is a threat.
That was going to be my next question. Like, when your researchers kind of looked at this, like the Steelman version, found the actual study, what was your all's kind of conclusion from that? Yeah.
So it was a little difficult, and I talked to you all before about how we thought about writing this blog post for a long time before we actually did. And part of the issue with that was, if you're going to write a blog post debunking what someone else is saying, it's a lot easier to do if they're making very specific, debunkable, falsifiable claims.
Yeah.
And part of our struggle with this topic was a lot of it was very vague. I'm not really sure what they mean. I want to make sure I'm not strawmanning people if there's something I'm missing. And we couldn't find very specific claims. And so it was hard to say this is definitely untrue because you're not really saying things that are true or not. They're kind of just like, well, what if, So the most technically accurate thing I can say is that I'm not seeing any strong evidence that this is a major concern. So you could technically accurately say, we don't know for sure that it's not, depending on what you require to say for sure. You know what I mean?
That's a really high bar,
That's why the strongest argument is the EPA should just test the water again and double check. And in my post, I even said, I don't think that's necessary, but I wouldn't mind if they did, like
it's great for peace of mind.
Not gonna hurt anything.
Right.
Yeah, I'd be fine with one study conclusively putting to bed this entire argument. Like, I would be fine with me if we were able to make that happen.
We also need to be realistic about, I was looking more into how the EPA decides things. There's tons of stuff the EPA doesn't even test at all. And then there's stuff that they're like, we're not testing this yet, but let's kind of keep an eye on it because maybe we should. And then there's stuff that they test very carefully. And the reality is they don't have infinite time and resources. So you have to make an argument about which things you're going to test for or not specific to abortion, just in life.
Yeah.
I think the strongest argument is abortion is an issue of great national controversy and concern. And the trust in the cultural institutions for huge proportions of the country are very, very, very low. And if you could do a study that was just like, we double checked everything you're saying, and it's not, that would be great. Although I would argue that the populations I'm thinking of who are suspicious would not be reassured by any study the EPA conducted because it's the EPA,
Right.
So,
So who would have to do the study then? Will you have to find outside experts who have the expertise and technology to be able to do the test themselves? Like some kind of independent?
So that is happening, apparently. One of the reasons I wasn't sure about the timing of my post is, like I said, I want to make sure I understand all the evidence and arguments for the people I'm disagreeing with.
Yeah.
And there is discussion of a study that's underway, that's under peer review, that's forthcoming, but I couldn't do anything with that because it currently is not in any way publicly accessible, and I have no idea what it says or what their methods were or anything. So I just had to move on. If in the future something is published that's a total game changer, then we'll just look at that and say that. But I can't hold back because you're promising that someday you'll show me the evidence you're talking about, you know? So...
All right. So this has been some good table setting. I have asked a whole bunch of questions because I'm used to doing one-on-one episodes with Monica. So I'm going to let Emily and Rebecca jump in and ask some questions or give some, like, what are your thoughts? What are your reactions to this either way?
Yeah, I feel like we should dive in to these actual arguments now and why we think they're false. I think personally we've done a pretty good job of explaining the best arguments for why people should be concerned or at least curious about the water supply. And so I think we should just kind of dive into, maybe if we want to separate this into kind of like talking first about the idea of human remains in our wastewater, then talking about mifepristone potentially in our wastewater, and then we kind of get to that secondary but also extremely important piece about how we talk about this affect women who have experienced miscarriage.
Yeah.
But I think that's slightly secondary. So if that just kind of like frames our discussion. Are we cool with that? Okay, so let's start.
Before we jump right in there, I guess I just have an initial thought, and I hadn't even thought of this like before we were in the middle of talking about this on the podcast, but like mifepristone isn't the only drug that ends up in our wastewater. Like every time somebody takes any kind of medication, that goes through their body somehow and probably ends up at least a significant portion of it in the toilet. And you also have people like literally flushing illegal drugs or drugs that they no longer use but aren't safe because they have children or pets around the house and want to get rid of them that way. So like, I agree with you, Monica. Like, I don't trust people who really, really, really care a lot about supporting abortion, including a lot of people in government, to notice and take seriously if there's like an abortion specific problem that's causing an environmental problem. But I do kind of trust that over the long period of time where people have been flushing other medications, either directly in much larger doses or by taking medications and having it pass through their bodies, that like that's not an abortion specific kind of thing where I have specific mistrust of the government because of ways that they're supporting abortion rights.
Yeah, that's a good point. The question of trusting the institutions, it's really a question about what, about what and in what context, you know? So I appreciate that.
And yeah, I think if mifepristone were a problem, it seems very plausible to me that like these other things would be a problem too. And that's not something that the government have a barrier to noticing. Sure.
Yeah. And especially I think the most familiar analog is probably birth control pills. There's a lot of people that are concerned about the increasing over the decades amount of birth control pills metabolized and how that's affecting hormones and things. So it's not really a totally new concern. It's just being applied in this specific case as abortion pills have been on the rise.
So have there been arguments before about concerns about how much like chemicals from birth control pills are going into the water, like a comparable argument that's been made before? Have there been other arguments on any other categories? Is it only birth control pills and abortion pills?
I'm not high confidence on that.
Okay.
I would venture to guess that there are some populations that are really concerned about everything Rebecca just said and how effective we are at monitoring these things. You know, the history of environmental regulation is a whole thing, and how much do we really care and what stakeholders are getting what kind of influence on how careful they have to be and so forth. Yeah. So it's a familiar tune, you know? I think it's not a crazy thing to at least ask.
Sure.
But I don't actually think that we have reason in this specific case to be especially concerned. So.
It's not an unreasonable thing to ask, but also it's the whole burden of proof thing. The person who makes the claim has the burden. And I know that we at ERI have like this big kind of like, we have like this dialogue test. It's like, try to not do burden of proof shifts all the time. It's really easy. Like make it like your last resort, but still, we're not saying never do it. Yeah. It is a thing. And there are absolutely times. I find myself doing this more lately, even sometimes when I'm dealing with particularly difficult people. Sometimes I'm having to do burden of proof shifts. And I hate it every time that I do it, but I'm like, okay, you're gonna have to defend like that thing that you just said.
I am very comfortable with it, and I even teach people on it. Training for pro-life dialogue. We start off with if this is an amicable, good conversation, and we want to keep it that way, and here's all the things you do it. But we have a subset that like, but if it's not,
right,
you know,
but
feel free to just say I'm not convinced.
Right. My point is, if you're going to make a big public thing about this
You're going to try to
argument,
pass legislation.
if you're going to try to pass legislation,
Yeah.
then you should like have the goods, like really like do your work and have really good arguments and research to back it up and be ready to defend
I want
it.
to make another point specific to our pro-life listeners and a pro-life audience. So, to my mind, this conversation about abortion pills in the environment is kind of another version of a trap law. By that, I mean, you know, the movement has historically had all kinds of different regulations that would ultimately result in an abortion clinic being shut down that weren't about specifically that you're taking the lives of children. Right. And I just want to say, I have no problem with trap laws if they are true and they make sense. So like if you have an abortion clinic that is not safe and it's not being held up to the same standards as any other, you know, outpatient facility, whatever, and it's going to get shut down because it can't hold itself up to those standards. You can't fit the ambulance gurney in the hallways, whatever. I'm fine with that. I will look you straight in the eye and say, I think it shouldn't be there because I don't think you should be killing valuable children. But if the reason you're getting rid of it is because it's also not safe, that's fine. I just want to say as a strategy, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
But it does need to be true.
Safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It needs to be true. It needs to be true. And also it is important to consider like all of the effects, not just whether.
I was just going to say, like, I think there's probably a spectrum of different kinds of things that have been targeted by trap laws. Mm-hmm. Some that would be like really obvious, yes, of
like,
course.
How are we arguing about this?
Everyone should have this. I feel like I also saw some things that were kind of like, I don't know how how defendable it is or how universally that would be applied, but I agree in general.
I'm open to the conversation.
Yes,
yeah, sure.
Of course, we want people to be safe.
I'm also open to like, I guess, trap law might be a phrase. Trap argument probably isn't. And I don't like mean it as a trap, but like arguments that appeal to values that the person I'm talking with already agrees with. And I think this is something this argument might be trying to do, talking to people who care a lot about the environment and saying, hey, maybe you and I disagree about abortion, but we might have common ground here, or I can appeal to values that you already have. I like that kind of argument. That's great. It's just got to be true.
You actually care, though. So, like, you set yourself up. You set yourself up so much for the person to ask, like, is there anything else that you've ever done or talked about or anything about that? And if your answer is no...
No, I'll go even further than Josh, though. I think if I don't actually care about this, but you do, and what I'm saying is true and something you should, I think it's fine if I don't and you do. I think that's fine. I'm not saying I do. I'm saying you do. And if you do... I'm just letting you know. I think that's fine. It's even better if I do too, but I'm not even pretending whether I do or not. You said you were worried about XYZ, and I just want you to know this about XYZ. That's fine. Mm-hmm. I actually admire it. I think it's smart and persuasive to find out what other people care about and describe your points in the context of their priorities. I think that's a good idea, generally, if you're doing it the right way.
Yeah.
You do need to be careful about sincerity, but even more so, you need to be careful about accuracy, and that breaks down a little bit for us with this argument. So again, I'm giving a lot of caveats. I can see why you'd initially be concerned.
Yep.
I get these kinds of strategies. I'm not against them per se. If I thought that there was a significant looming danger to the environment, to women in consuming wastewater because of abortion pills, I would be right there with you. That's a big deal. I don't think that is the case.
Yeah.
And then the secondary thing about people who've miscarried, that's kind of an emotional kernel for me, but I agree with Emily that it is kind of in terms of rationale, it's kind of a secondary issue. So
let's just walk straight down those arguments then.
Yeah.
I think where I want to take us is to kind of the best version of each of those claims, and then give Monica a chance to respond and give us all kind of the chance to discuss. So if I frame us starting with just the human remains, ignoring Mifepristone, the fact there's human remains in our wastewater. The proponents that we've heard who've like talked about this idea and why it's concerning, talk about kind of several different potential options. So some people argue more narrowly that it's much more developed children, later gestational ages, if that's getting flushed down the toilet, ending up in our wastewater, that's really concerning. We've never seen anything quite like that before where it's a more developed child going in. Then some proponents have had a much broader assertion in this category that's saying, even embryonic remains at earlier gestational ages, they can also pose an environmental threat. And there's just lots of other tissue that's then going in. We've got maybe placenta that's going in. We've got all the stuff that's happening in pregnancy, which is a whole lot more than what's happening when women just have periods. There's just like a lot of stuff that's getting potentially put down the toilet in human remains. That's my best attempt at arguing why we should be concerned about that. So Monica, I would love you to respond to me saying things I don't actually believe, but that's my best attempt at what they're kind of trying to argue in the human remains department.
So I think the strongest version of this argument, where we're just talking about human remains, is the argument that we're talking further along in gestational age.
Yeah.
And I think it is true that as we see the proliferation of abortion pills, especially the ones that are provided outside of a medical setting, you are going to see that more often. It's not supposed to be happening. It's not regulated, but it is going to happen more often. We've heard some horror stories already in the United States and in the UK about people taking abortion pills much later in pregnancy than they're supposed to. And then what do they do with the body? And I think that the strongest version of that is our wastewater systems are not designed to handle bodies with skeletons and all these things. I don't think Mifepristone and abortion pill arguments in terms of chemistry are the right argument for that. The right argument for that is you can't just have unregulated, just mailing abortion pills everywhere all the time, and then people are doing these dangerous things. I would speculate that it's still on the scale of wastewater management, very, very rare. But I think the problems with it aren't going to be chemistry so much as physical blockages, and also, frankly, the mental health of wastewater management people, in addition to other things. I think that's a fair, grim, gruesome, fair thing to mention. I also think it's probably comparatively rare. The vast majority of the time, the human remains being flushed are going to be early in pregnancy at levels where, I hate talking about this, it is graphic. Just want to pause and say, if you've had pregnancy loss in your history or whatever, like, this is a graphic episode and I apologize. But at the levels we're talking about, they're going to be treated the same way as other biodegradable human materials, as menstruation. Like the processes used to treat the water will work the same way for a very early embryo as for menstrual material. And I hate talking about it. It's very upsetting. I think there are plenty of moral discussions to be had. But in terms of the risk to the environment, I don't see an argument that this is different. And I have brought it up once or twice with some people. And Rebecca also, I know, has asked about this. And the responses have mostly been focused on the moral differences, which I'm not saying moral differences aren't important. I'm just saying, for the conversation about threats to the environment, wastewater management isn't making distinctions morally between the different kinds of human tissue and fluids that they are receiving. So that's what I'm saying. That was actually really difficult to rebut, because there was no specific argument as to why this would be more of a problem than menstruation. And I would even say that talking about just the human remains is kind of a straw man version of this. I have seen people make those claims, but most of the people arguing about this are arguing about Mifepristone, which is different. So I do want to pause and say, and this is getting a little out of order, this is where we need to be more aware of how we're talking about this, because especially if you're not talking about Mifepristone and you're just talking about human remains, people miscarry into toilets all the time. And it's very, very upsetting and difficult for a lot of people. Our cultural institutions, I think, up to this point have basically failed in terms of caring for pregnancy loss families and parents. I have talked to many women who were going through a miscarriage experience and interfaced with the medical community, and at no point had anyone warn them or talk to them about what the experience would be like, what they're supposed to do if they want to keep the remains, what they're supposed to do if they accidentally pass remains in the toilet. There's no prep at all, which is crazy because there's about 1 million miscarriages a year in the United States. And that's presumably been going on since humanity existed. And for some reason, the medical community, most of the time, there's exceptions. There's some hospitals that are really on point, but most of the time they just tell you, if you have XYZ symptoms, let us know, because that could be a concern. Otherwise, you're fine to just complete this miscarriage at home. And if you experience, cramping, take some Tylenol. And they don't really address the emotional, psychological component. I don't think it occurs to them that this is a thing. And so as a result, and in addition to that, miscarriage is the great muted grief. So even though you probably know a bunch of women who've gone through something, they've probably never talked to you about it, and they don't know you're going through it because you're not talking to them about it. And so this knowledge just keeps getting forever buried. And all these women and their partners or whoever go home, don't realize what it's going to be like, and are totally unprepared. Some of them don't flush. Some of them try to get the remains out. Some of them panic and flush. Some of them sit next to the toilet for hours and hours, not sure what to do. I can't talk about it without crying, but it is a very sore point. So as we're talking about this, I think it's important to just remember, just like when you talk about issues of abortion with rape, issues of abortion with disability, like these different heightened sensitivities, consider that you are talking to someone who has been through the thing that you're talking about. Try to keep that in mind, because I have been in on several conversations now with people who are concerned about the environmental issue. And it doesn't seem to me like they're thinking about that at all. And that is actually the emotional kernel of why I wrote this, more than the chemistry, right? So anyway, tangent.
Yeah.
It's really important. Part. I mean, we want to talk about the facts and the truth also, and like what makes the most sense. What should we believe? But I completely agree with you. Like, the way that we talk about this has a huge effect.
Yeah.
And I want to make
many
sure
people.
We have time to camp there at the end of this podcast. I think we need to spend significant time there.
Yeah.
Sure. So that's the human remains one, though. Long and short, I haven't seen any specific explanation or any evidence that early embryonic remains will be treated differently than the many human bodily fluids and tissues that go into the wastewater all the time. So I don't know how to rebut it, because I haven't been able to find what they mean.
Right. It's not even a burden of proof thing. It's like a burden of like, can you make an actual argument here? Can you present some kind of actual evidence here? Like, you can't prove to me that this is not the case is not actually an argument. If we have no evidence whatsoever that it is the case, and if it's not the case in a bunch of very similar scenarios, like with menstrual fluid or other kinds of human waste, if you but this is a whole organism, I think I've heard, people flush dead fish down the toilet. And we don't hear people talking about that. And again, it gets that's very morally different. And
morally, yes, but on a chemistry level, when you say this is a whole organism, which I agree is very morally different, but on a chemistry level, what does that mean to you? What do you think that means? Not you, Rebecca, but like the person you're talking to. I don't know what you mean. Like, what are the materials of the organism that you think are going to be significantly different than menstrual products? And maybe there's an argument out there. I have not heard it. And one of the things I have my research team do, it's not just give me this study and explain it. It's, can you figure out what this person is talking about? Can you guys look at that? Because I don't have time to always look, and I'll just ask them, go find me the best case, right? And we couldn't really find anything on that.
And it's not even just
behind
that
the scenes fact of secular pro-life.
It's not even just that I haven't heard an argument. Like, here's the physiological difference. Here's why this is causing a problem, even though menstrual fluid isn't, or these other things aren't. It's, I actually asked, I went to a presentation where a speaker was talking about concerns about environmental impacts of flushing aborted embryos or fetuses. And I asked very specifically, because I was really curious about this. I actually hadn't heard that argument before this presentation. And I asked, specifically, what is the physiological difference? What is causing this? And this researcher who'd done all of this research into these specific arguments and all of the empirical things said she couldn't give me one. She said it's morally very different. And I think that's actually really telling. I think what's going on in the back of a lot of people's heads making this argument is it's really horrible and uncomfortable for people. And maybe we can actually shake people out of their moral, acclimatization to abortion by talking about the fact that there are dead children in our wastewater. If people are used to the idea of abortion but not used to the idea of dead children in the water, maybe we can shake them out of their kind of moral stupor that way. But what they're saying is there are environmental impacts. And I think maybe what they're meaning and what they're most trying to get across and what's like most the emotional kernel of it for them, what that's driving them is actually the moral difference. But we're not maybe unintentionally, we're ending up not being very honest about that in the way that people in the pro-life movement making this argument are making it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's totally fair to talk about how it's horrifying to think about flushing embryonic and fetal children, whether through miscarriage or abortion. It is horrifying.
This is like a logic thing to just like be paying attention to in general. If someone makes a factual claim and you ask a factual question about what they said, and then they respond with a moral claim, that's not the right answer.
It could still be an important moral claim.
Yes.
Right. Just didn't answer my question, though.
What we're talking about right now is at best a red herring right now. I asked about a different thing.
And like Rebecca said, it's also telling because if you had something, you would have said, you know?
Especially if you're a researcher.
Yeah. So that's the human remains part. The Mifepristone claim is much stronger because, first of all, we're talking about a chemical difference. You know, in the vast, vast majority of cases with miscarriage, I actually don't know what the proportion is, but I believe in the vast majority of cases, there's no Mifepristone involved. I do want to make a very important note. I talk about this in the blog post. That is starting to change. Okay. Mifepristone and misoprostol, the abortion pill regimen, it can also be used to manage miscarriage. And because of the way regulations around abortion pills and things have changed so much in the last few years, I linked this in the post. There's a study showing that it is increasingly being used to manage miscarriage. So, and we can talk more about that later, but just saying this bright line distinction we're trying to make between affecting people who are going through miscarriage versus only people who are getting abortions isn't as bright as the people saying it would like to think. So right off the bat, you could definitely have people enduring miscarriage and Mifepristone is involved. You could have that. It's still pretty uncommon. So one of the most common responses that people talking about the environmental concern get, and I know because they've said this, like this is one of our most common responses, is people concerned about miscarriage, and they'll say, well, you know, we're talking about Mifepristone. We're talking about tainted with Mifepristone with the chemical abortion pill, however they phrase it, you know, and generally, broadly speaking, they're right, you know. So the question then is, if we let go of the whole just human remains concern, we're just talking about human remains that have Mifepristone in them. That's the whole thing. And that's a much stronger claim. There's a couple of different points I want to make about this. The first one is, and I haven't seen anyone address this, and maybe I think it's a bigger deal than it is, but over 90% of Mifepristone is metabolized in feces and urine, not the embryo. So I don't know if people know that or not. I've never seen it brought up. But if our concern is supposed to be about Mifepristone in the environment, then you would be arguing that you need to catch people's feces and urine and dispose of it a different way, because that's where most of the Mifepristone is going. Just want to point that out.
Interesting.
So right away, it's like, and then I'm trying to think of the Steelman version for the people making this argument, and maybe it's like, okay, but that means almost maybe 8 to 10% of it is in the embryonic remains, and you're like, okay, yeah, we could keep talking about that too.
But if 8 to 10% of it is a huge deal, then 90% of it is a much, much huger deal.
Right. Maybe we need to collect all of it. Maybe we need to collect the feces and the urine and the remains.
Getting a lot worse fast. Yeah. And keep in mind too, when you're metabolizing this, you're not having a single instance of you going to the bathroom. This is over the course of a couple days.
Right.
Just wanted to point that out too.
That's also really spread out then, right? Probably.
Yeah. And so I haven't seen anyone address that. I don't know if they know or not or whatever, but that's the first thing. Another thing that's really interesting that I didn't know before we started doing this project is that besides miscarriage and besides abortion, Mifepristone is used to treat Cushing's syndrome. And this is really interesting. If you do the math, and I've checked this several times because I kind of can't believe it, but really? I've checked it several times and it's true. In Cushing's syndrome, there's only like on the order magnitude of thousands of people who need treatment for Cushing's syndrome with Mifepristone, compared to, you know, we're talking hundreds of thousands, maybe we're getting close to 1 million people a year using abortion pills. Okay, so right away you're like, well, there's no way, surely, that more Mifepristone is coming from Cushing's syndrome. I actually am not sure, because in Cushing's syndrome, you're taking Mifepristone every day, and you're taking higher doses of it than are in the abortion pill regimen, and it can max up. Okay.
I want to give specific numbers, Monica, because I read this in your article too, and I think this is really helpful for people to know. So I pulled it up.
Let me look. So I tell you the truth. Okay.
Okay.
Hold on a second. Okay. In Cushing syndrome, and to be clear, not everyone who has Cushing syndrome uses Mifepristone to manage it. I'm not saying they are. Okay. But some subset of them are. And so in the abortion pill regimen, it's 200 milligrams of Mifepristone. So keep that as your baseline, okay? 200 milligrams of Mifepristone for, just making the math easy, about 1 million people a year. That's a lot of Mifepristone.
Each person takes it once. So it's 200 milligram pill and you're done.
Yeah. And it's not really 1 million because still a lot of them do DNCs and stuff. But order of magnitude, it's hundreds of thousands a year, 200 milligrams of Mifepristone. So Cushing syndrome, it's probably more like 1,000 people. And they start at 300 milligrams every day, and it can increase to up to 1,200 milligrams a day, and they can take it for years. So even though there's only order of magnitude 1,000 versus order of magnitude 100,000s, when you look at what they're taking and how much, it might not be more, but it's actually a lot closer to parity than you'd think. And I don't know if the people making the environmental claim knew about this, because I didn't, But
that's really relevant if
it
80
is
to
relevant.
90% of this is passed through urine and feces, which people with Cushing syndrome are certainly doing, even if they're not having abortions.
Sure. And whether it's passed through urine or feces or whatever, it has to pass out of your body eventually, right? The point is, if Mifepristone in the environment is the concern, then you would be looking at urine and feces, and you would be looking at Cushing syndrome, and you would be crafting things about Mifepristone and not about abortion. Because it could also be with miscarriage, but also other things. Now, I'm trying to steel man, can't do all things at once. Maybe this is just one thing at a time, and you can look at the abortion pills in their own context, but actually really, if you were really worried about Mifepristone, Cushing's would be way easier to regulate. It's only going to affect 1,000 people, So I don't know if they knew that or not, but again, these different things where you're like, that doesn't prove that there's no environmental concern. I want to be clear. I'm just saying, if there is an environmental concern, it seems like we'd be talking about these other elements also.
And it seems likely that it would have come up by now. We would be seeing that by now, right?
And I want to take a note, little soapbox here, and this doesn't just apply to us. It doesn't just apply to pro-life people. This applies to everyone, everywhere, all the time. When you're in a disagreement type situation, you really want to take the time to have someone who authentically disagrees with you tell you why they think you're wrong. Yes. If you're only asking your team what they might say, you will not get as good of a response. I mean, I pick my research team very selectively, and they have really strong academic backgrounds. That's the first quality. And the second quality is I have to believe that they really try to be objective, and they really try to know, but they are all still pro-life. And so sometimes I have my own sources who aren't, where I'm like, if I said this, what would you say? And they give me different responses than my extremely smart, well-intentioned research team.
Wow.
You got to have people that really do actually disagree with you to tell you. And the reason I bring all this up is because the proponents of this argument, I haven't seen them mention the excretion methods. I haven't seen them mention Cushing's, because they probably, I think, I hate saying what people think or know or do. I'm just guessing. I don't know. But if I'm them, I wouldn't have known. Because you have to have someone who actually doesn't believe you telling you why they think you're wrong. You can't just. I would guess that they didn't know about these things. To be clear, when they don't mention these things, I don't assume that they know them and they're not saying it. I assume they don't know. Okay. Anyway, blah, 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 soapbox. So none of that gets to why we're sure it's not a problem. That's just saying, what about all these? If we're going to be serious about this, what about all these other things,
Right.
So getting down to actually specifically why we think it's not a problem is tricky, because in environmental regulation and with chemicals and stuff, a lot of it is you kind of have to prove there's a good reason to think it will be a problem before they will really check. And so the Steelman argument is, well, you didn't really check. And their rebuttal, FDA, EPA will be like, you haven't given us any reason to really think it's a problem. So this is going to come down to if you trust the FDA. Okay? I'll just say that.
No, I don't want that to be what it is. That can't be what it is. There's too many people.
It is kind of for me. It's kind of for me that, and I'm not. I have a lot of skepticism in institutions, but just when I say trust, I don't mean trust their overall intentions, trust their competence, trust whatever. I mean, like, they wrote a very specific letter detailing why they don't think is a problem. So you would have to believe that they're lying about what they investigated, lying about their literal calculations. Like, it's a level of lying that's much more intentional and specific than just these institutions don't care. And as a culture, they're not going to really look into this. I can buy that second thing I said. But if someone comes to you and says, we did these calculations and got this answer, then you either believe that they did them or not. Yeah. You see what I'm saying?
I want to dive into those for a second, because I think that's helpful for people to know exactly what the FDA letter said and like what the assumptions were there. So they were basically using extremely conservative assumptions. So we can link that letter in the description. But they were trying to like kind of look at the current rates of mifepristone use, which, as we said, is significantly higher than it has been in decades past, and very conservative assumptions about it in order to calculate basically what the worst case scenario could be of the amount of mifepristone going into the environment. So specifically, their assumptions were that all mifepristone that is produced would actually be used. Again, that's an unrealistic assumption, but they went the very conservative. All mifepristone produced would actually be used. There would be even distribution of that mifepristone throughout the United States. None of the mifepristone would be metabolized by the human body, and none of it would be depleted or removed through normal waste treatment processes.
That's another crazy one. Yeah.
Yeah. Insane. None of it would be depleted or removed through normal waste treatment process.
They're basically, so they assumed all of it gets used as opposed to people keeping it in their medicine cabinet or losing it or whatever. Okay. They assume none of it's metabolized and none of it is removed through wastewater treatment, which effectively they're saying everything that's used is just dumped straight into the toilet. Like, without any human interference, besides just like take the pills, put them all straight into the wastewater, okay? Which is a crazy, like, that's not what's happening. But they use that as their assumption, and they still found that it would be less than 1 part per billion in the aquatic environment, which is low enough that that's considered like not an issue of concern.
Yeah.
So you could believe them or not, but what you can't do is say they haven't addressed the increased usage. They did address it. You could believe them or not, but they did address it. And they did it in a very conservative way. And they basically said, we don't see an argument as to why this would be a heightened concern compared to like all these other chemicals that we deal with. And so we're not going to really.
And we aren't aware of a good response from the pro-life side, or the side that would be pushing this argument. Like, we're not aware of data.
I'm aware that some of them have said they're going to do their own study, which legit, you know,
Sure,
like test certain parts of water in certain areas and calculate it themselves. Legit, you know, and if you do that and it's, you know, the methodology makes sense and all this stuff, and you find something really, really concerning, that's a much stronger argument, you know. But we don't have access to that currently. And everything else I've been able to find suggests this is the evidence is just not there.
Yeah. And importantly, like, again, we don't have to trust the FDA that the people involved in making these decisions don't have particular motives around protecting abortion rights that would lead them to do this differently. For one thing, these are hard numbers. This is not a, it's not a problem. That it would be really easy to say out of motivated reasons. Like, these are numbers that you'd have to be like straight up pretty intentionally lying about. In ways that I imagine would be pretty falsifiable. And also, it's not just abortion. We talked about Cushing syndrome. Like, it's like, even if someone has like particular motives that could lead them to be misleading around things related to abortion, there are other drugs that we do the exact same process for in terms of deciding, do we need to be concerned about this? And there are also other uses of the abortion pill, like Cushing syndrome, that this applies to. So it's not, you need to trust the FDA that the FDA has perfect motives when it comes to not letting their desire to protect abortion rights impact anything else that they say. That's not what we're saying.
Because I don't. But I'm just saying there's different levels of distrust, and the level of distrust I'd have to have here would be unprecedentedly high. Yeah. And also it brings me back to the thing I was saying earlier. If we do have that level of distrust in these institutions, why are we asking them to do any research? We're not going to believe anything they say anyway. So kind of catch-22 there. But yes, so that's ultimately why you can't say this definitely for sure isn't a problem, because you can't prove that. But I will say I don't see good reason to believe it really is a problem. And I will go even further and say this is bringing us into the more emotional component of it. You might even be able to convince me that even if you don't have a really strong reason to believe it's a problem, it is still legit to be pointing these things out as an issue of concern and trying to just to be safe, minimize the amount of mifepristone going into the water and asking them to do additional testing and stuff. Like if the argument was like, well, why not? What's it going to hurt if we at least are super, super, super cautious? I think I still would land on against, because to me, the levels of certainty aren't, oh, we don't know. It's like, there's not a problem, but maybe you could convince me. But the thing that really just like so solidly just completely puts me on the side of hard pass, really not into this, is the way that it can affect people who have miscarried.
Yeah.
And I've already talked more than once now about the experiences of people when they go home and they have to deal with this. And that was more just me talking about cultural stigma, making people feel shame and silence who you might not have intended to, not realizing what they're going through. But there are very practical ways, not just emotional and psychological sadness, but practical ways that I think this is harmful. Okay?
Say more.
The first one is that we already have a lot of extended grief and difficulty after miscarriage because it's so muted and undiscussed, and shaming and stigmatizing people further and making them feel terrible about that they flushed the remains of their children or didn't know what to do will make that worse, both in the sense of how they feel and in the odds of people opening up to others and seeking healing and stuff. Okay. But also, we're seeing increasingly news stories, and in fairness, they're always about people who are further along in pregnancy than the first trimester. But we're increasingly seeing news stories of like early second trimester miscarriage and them not knowing what to do with the remains, and either huge amounts of shame heaped upon them, or they get arrested for desecration of a corpse or abuse of a corpse or things like that. And I'm trying to extend a conversation about how, don't get me wrong, you should not be able to do literally whatever you want with a small fetal body, but we should be coming from a place of compassion, not only for the emotional and psychological and physical experience, but for the fact, and this is the part that really gets me, our institutions don't support people in this. They don't give them information. They don't tell them how to handle it. They just kind of send them on their way. And we could be doing a lot more with that before we're like, and that's a felony. And so this kind of stigmatizing language around pregnancy loss at home, I think makes that worse. But then the one that really gets me, the one where I won't be able to talk about it without crying probably, is in the lost communities, there's a whole thing about being able to retain the remains of your children through miscarriage. And there's a wide range of experiences with, first of all, parents being forewarned in advance if they've never had a loss, what they might feel about that. A lot of times they don't realize how they're going to feel about it until after it's too late to keep the remains and have cremation or have a burial or have some kind of grieving process, and it's too late. They don't realize how they're going to feel about it in the middle of the crisis happening. Then there are people who know in advance how they're going to feel about it, and for a variety of reasons are still not able to keep the remains. And this usually makes grieving harder and longer and more difficult. And in particular, there are people who do have their miscarriages completed in a medical setting, and then the hospital will not give them the remains and incinerate the remains as medical waste. And this really can deepen trauma. And I feel very, very strongly that unless and until we have much better social level practices and supports about this, which right now essentially don't exist, there is nothing wrong with someone completing a miscarriage at home and burying the remains in their yard or finding a way to get cremation and keep them with them. And that is often a healing thing that they should be able to do. And the reason I bring all of that up is because so far, none of this legislation about catch kits has passed anywhere. And the ones that have even been put to a vote have worded very carefully that they're only meant to apply to people seeking abortion. But it is not at all clear to me that the people proposing this legislation and the people writing it understand why it might apply to people experiencing miscarriage. And if we get to a situation where we pass legislation that's going to mean that someone who has a miscarriage has to return the bodies of their children to a medical facility to be destroyed, I'm going to lose my mind.
Yep.
Okay? And
Yep.
so I mentioned that it took us a long time to get around to writing this post for a couple different reasons. And to be frank, one of those reasons was I hate spending time arguing with other pro-lifers. I hate it because we are on the same page that abortion is taking the life of valuable children and that we must do something about it. And I'm so glad that you're off the bench doing something about it. I spend half of my time trying to convince people to even agree that it even is a problem. And then once they do, get them to like literally say or do anything about it whatsoever. And you're out here swinging away. And I love that. And the other side has so many more resources than we do. I don't want to waste any of my time and energy fighting with you. You know, I hate doing that. I do hate doing that. Okay. So I stalled for a long time on this because I don't want to spend time arguing with other pro-lifers. And the thing that made me change my mind was one of the organizations pushing for this had like an FAQ, like a, what was it called? It was rebuttals to common arguments about the abortion pills in the environment thing.
Like in a presentation or like an article or something? It
was like a PDF
like a written
document.
Thing? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and this is a screen cap from...
And we'll read for the audio listeners, but this part is going to be easier if you are watching this on YouTube.
Yes. So this is a screen cap from an organization that has a website about concerns about the environment and abortion pills and so forth. And I noticed that they had a section called Rebuttals to Common Arguments, and I went to look at that because of the many different questions and concerns we've been discussing. And the first argument they list is related to miscarriage. And I want to say again, as I've been talking to different people about this, I've had at least 3, including this, people suggest that a lot of people are asking them about their concerns about miscarriage. This is not unique to me. And I think that matters because the more people are asking you about this, the more it is incumbent upon you to make sure that your answer
is good.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Is good.
It's not
true.
surprising. It seems like an obvious question. This is not surprising. That
and maybe it wasn't obvious when they first started looking into this conversation, but it's clearly been obvious for a while if it's like your most common thing you need to rebut. Okay?
I'm charitable.
So that gets a little...
Yeah.
So I'm showing you a screen cap I took because it helps me find the highlights of what I want to talk about. But to repeat again, we hesitated about doing this blog because we don't like fighting with other pro-lifers and kind of need the emotional energy to bother. And this is what gave me the emotional energy.
Yeah.
Right here. Because the first argument they are rebutting is the medical waste from abortions is no different from the medical waste from miscarriages. In both cases, the woman is generating medical waste, not the abortion provider. I don't care about the generation argument. That's a legal thing I don't care about. But they're responding to the concern that you're going to sweep up people who've had miscarriages in your arguments about abortion. And I'll go through it with you point by point, but essentially their response said to me, they don't know and maybe don't care what it's like for people having miscarriage, and they're not trying to figure it out, despite a lot of people apparently bringing it up to them. And that made me really mad. So their response is, this is a very sensitive and challenging topic to address, and it is vital to note that the two are vastly different. For example, many expectant moms suffering the loss of their baby will go to the hospital. I'm going to pause right there. It's very common to experience miscarriage at home. And I'm speaking from talking to a lot of people in pregnancy loss groups, and I'm very vocal about my miscarriages, which means people feel comfortable telling me about this, okay? Yeah. It's also very common to be experiencing a miscarriage and go to a hospital, an emergency room, whatever, and they check to see if you're stable. And if you are, they tell you you're fine and you can go complete this at home. And as we referenced before, they won't say, and you might have these issues with the remains and you might need to do this. They'll just say, if you're bleeding too much, if you have this and this, call us. Otherwise, you're fine to finish this in your own setting. And by the way, just while I'm complaining, a lot of women don't have the luxury of just staying home for days waiting for their miscarriage to complete. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. A lot of women still have to go to work. And are you going to be miscarrying your baby in your work office bathroom? Like, this is a hard thing, but it's very, very common, unless there's some specific reason to think of added extra physical danger to the woman. It's very common to just send them back home. So it frustrated me when they were saying, well, they'll be in a hospital. Actually, a whole lot of them, I would argue probably most of them, are not miscarrying in a hospital. And it's frustrating to me that you seem, I don't know if you know that, Then they say where they can receive proper treatment in accordance with all state and local laws. I said to you already before that some parents have had major issues where They want the remains of their child, and the hospital will not give them to them. So some people don't even want to go to a hospital because of a variety of interactions they've had with medical teams who have been, at worst, a little too casual and sometimes actively hostile and rude. This is getting into a whole other conversation about medicine.
But it's good to point out that you can't just say, oh, the state and local laws will take care of it. Sometimes the state and local laws are already problematic in your state, are already problems.
Right. Yes. Well, and a lot of times at the hospital, they're not following any particular law. There's no law that they have to do it this way. They just don't have a specific... This is a good time, really quick, for me to tell you that partly because of our being my organization, my research team, I have a lot of people that work for me and volunteer with me who've had miscarriages. Our collective anger, we wanted to be more productive than just ranting online. And so we put together a suggested hospital protocol for helping patients with their miscarried remains.
Really?
Because I want to say again, I'll give you the link for it. I think it's like secularprolife.org/disposition protocol. And you can also find it under our content. We just released it a week or two ago. And I will say again, for a lot of hospitals, this is not a legal issue. There's nothing legally keeping them from letting the parents have their remains, but they're not sure, or there's no reason for them to take on the added liability, or they really don't know and they think that it is. I'm not going to drag you through it right now, but I went through extraordinary effort to get the remains of my son that I miscarried. Extraordinary effort in a place where it was completely legal, in an urban environment in California where they must deal with miscarriage every day. And it was ridiculous how many different people I had to talk to and argue with to get this to happen. And with that background, when I see people be like, oh, they'll be at a hospital, which is always totally coherent and competent and compassionate, I'm like, okay, great. So, but again, I will say a lot of people don't. We just did a live stream at SPL with Leah Sargent about this and her own miscarriage experiences and mine. And she was talking about how she has had 6 miscarriages and she started avoiding medical settings and just trying to deal with them in the privacy of her own home because of the way doctors had treated her.
Wow.
So just saying, usually I feel like it's the pro-choice side that is a little too glib about how intelligent and compassionate and reasonable doctors are. But in this case, kind of feel like we're doing it. And so anyway.
Yeah.
Then they say...
where they can receive proper treatment in accordance with all state and local laws. If you go to the hospital, it'll be dealt with in accordance with the laws. It kind of sounds like that's saying, including the laws that we're trying to pass. Like women who miscarry aren't going to have to deal with this at home and accidentally violate these laws because the hospitals are going to follow these laws for them. And that brings me back to, does that mean that you are relying on the hospitals to treat this as medical waste and take the remains away from the woman and dispose of them as medical waste? And again, that's horrific when you have a woman who has a dead baby that she wants to grieve and mourn and bury or cremate or treat as her dead child instead of as medical waste.
Yeah. There's whole organizations, multiple different whole organizations that are dedicated to helping parents who have experienced miscarriage within medical settings communicate effectively with those people to be able to get their remains to grieve and bury. Like dedicated to this problem that it seems to me to be an entirely unforced error. I don't know why it's such a problem, but anyway, yes.
And it seems like the rebuttal is saying, actually, we're going to make that worse. Like the solution, the way that we are going to distinguish between abortion and miscarriage and say that we're not going to cause a problem for miscarriage is to say that, no, miscarriages happen in hospitals and hospitals will follow this law that we're passing so that women don't accidentally violate it at home if they're miscarrying. I imagine, like, the way to do that would be to treat this dead fetus as medical waste, which is
they do all the time.
Right, exactly. And that's just making this problem even worse.
Right. It certainly, I don't believe that the people who wrote this had the intent of what you just said, but it certainly doesn't seem like they were being careful to avoid it.
Right.
So then they say, they can receive proper treatment in accordance with the law. Even for those who do not go to a hospital, not all will willingly flush their baby down the toilet. And it was the not all where I was like, okay. So you know that some people who are miscarrying are flushing their children down the toilet, and you're just like, but a lot of them don't. So whatever. Okay. Then they say,
as big of a problem. Is it like?
I don't know.
I
was. You should have seen me the first time I read this. So then it says, furthermore, in the case of induced abortion, the fetal remains are tainted by the chemical abortion pill. This one I think is pretty forgivable because, like I said, it's increasingly becoming the case that Mifepristone is used to manage miscarriage, but it is kind of a new thing. it's not very common at this time. It's happening more, but it's still pretty unusual. And so I just wanted to highlight that this isn't the bright line distinction they're saying, but I get why they would think that it was. When I had my second miscarriage in California in 2019, they offered me abortion pills. They basically offered me abortion options. I do not think miscarriages are abortions. I'm just saying the medical treatments. They said we can do expected management and wait and see if you pass the remains on your own. We can do a D&C. We can manage it medically, which means, and in that context, it meant Mifepristone and Misoprostol. Okay. And I know other women in California from just having lived there so long who used Mifepristone and Misoprostol to manage miscarriages. So just pointing out that there are miscarriages that are managed with Mifepristone. And if we believe that this is an important environmental issue, you're not going to be able to make such a clean line between the women getting abortions that we morally object to and the women having miscarriages that we don't. So that's complicated. And then the last thing is they said, as an abortion is planned, the possible effect of the outcome, expelling human tissue on our water, can be mitigated. And I just want to say that it sounded to me like they're trying to contrast this with miscarriage, which is not planned, which on a emotional, social level, that's true. But on a medical level, that's not always true. So you can have, first I want to say, let's say it was true that miscarriages are always this spontaneous, unpredictable thing. Then why are you expecting everyone to make it to a hospital to have their miscarriage? If it's so hard to plan that you couldn't get a catch kit, why do you think it's easy enough to plan that you could end up at a hospital before it's over? I feel like those completely contradict each other. But also, that's not how all miscarriages are. You can have threatened miscarriages where there's good reason to think that you probably are going to have a miscarriage. You haven't had one yet. You're really, really hoping that you don't, but you know that you might or probably will. And you do have time. And some women have gone to get catch kits knowing they're probably going to have a miscarriage. You have incomplete miscarriages and missed miscarriages. If you don't know, missed miscarriages when your child has died, but your body has not expelled the remains. And most of the time eventually will, and sometimes doesn't, and you need medical intervention. But in either case, there's a delay between the knowledge of it and expelling the remains. There are plenty of situations where people who experience miscarriage would have time to get a catch kit, which, by the way, is a good thing. It's a tragic good thing. And I wish more people knew catch kits existed if that was something that they wanted to do. But my point is, this document is trying to draw all these clear lines between women experiencing miscarriage and women who are having abortions. And all it really did for me was emphasize that they somehow don't really know much about miscarriage at all. To think that it's mostly happening in hospitals and that will be fine in terms of the remains, to think that it's mostly happening in such an unpredictable way that you couldn't expect catch kits, that's all nonsense. And by the time I read this document, I've already had a couple of conversations with a couple of people expressing skepticism and concern about this argument, and not, like Rebecca was talking about, not getting a lot back that makes me feel like this is really thought out. And I've been feeling over the last, this isn't coming on like 3 years now, over the last couple of years, as it's been increasingly coming up, not really sure and feeling a little bit, conflicted and a little bit skeptical. But then the thing that's really getting me is when I bring up concerns about the lost communities that I am part of, and they seem to be unaware and they don't care. And that really makes me mad, especially coming from the community that we're supposed to be, our whole thing is supposed to be valuing embryonic and fetal life. And in a way that feels like it's kind of getting thrown out the window for this argument. I hate assigning motive. I think the people doing this really are trying to prevent abortions. And I think a good chunk of them really are worried about the environment. I do think that. But multiple people have been bringing up this concern to you, and you really don't seem like you're trying to figure it out. You seem like you're just trying to come up with ad hoc reasons why it's not a problem. Yeah. And that's not going to be very comforting to the mom who wants to take her baby home and can't because you decided to pass this legislation despite a whole bunch of people saying, we're worried about this.
The pro-choice side has spent like 40 or 50 years accusing us of only caring about fetuses. And we have spent the last 30, 40, 50 years being like, we are pro-mom and child. We're pro both. If you are trying to demonstrate that you actually care about both, this isn't the way.
Yeah, it's very upsetting. I'm very upset. So that's what inspired me to write the article, even though I was skeptical of the facts of the claims. We've been trying to talk about the Steelman versions, but when they write something like that, I'm like, I'm hearing, we really don't care. We don't really care how this is going to work out. Ends justify the means. And I am, really upset about it.
Yeah, I think to not steel man for a second, or maybe in a way this is steel manning in a different direction. But I think one other thing that could be going on here is, again, I guess the fact that people raising data and numbers around here are all the reasons it doesn't really make sense that this could be causing an actual environmental impact or health impact for humans or on fish or other aspects of our environment. And the fact that it just seems like not a concern to them. Like, obviously abortion and miscarriage are really different. And I don't need to even though I'm hearing this argument a lot, I don't need to dive in and actually understand in order to tell you that obviously they're different. It brings me back around to, I really feel like a lot of what's going on here, maybe not for everybody bringing this up, but for a lot of people, is morally, I'm really opposed to abortion. Morally, I'm really horrified that aborted, unjustly killed babies are ending up in our wastewater. And that horrifies and moves me in a way that I'm hoping it will move other people. And I want to use that to fight abortion. And if that's your argument, okay, I don't think it's the best argument. I don't think it's going to be as compelling to pro-choice people as you think it is, even though it's really understandably emotionally moving for you. But fine, make that argument. Because if you're making that argument, then there is a really clear difference between unjustly killed babies ending up in our wastewater and babies who have died unintentionally ending up in our wastewater. And I think maybe that's what's going on in the back of people's heads of obviously abortion and miscarriage are different. Obviously aborted and miscarried babies ending up in wastewater are different because they're morally different. And I'm going to say if what's going on in the back of your head is the moral argument and the desire to raise moral concern with people about this or get at people's hearts in new ways about why abortion is so horrible, then make that argument. Don't make the environmental argument and make claims with this moral kind of hidden premise or hidden argument behind it, trying to get it. Yeah, exactly. Don't make false or at least very, very unverified with no reason to believe them and reason not to believe them claims about environmental impact that end up also affecting miscarriage. Make the claim you really want to make about abortion, because then it's really clear what the difference is between the two, and you're being more honest about where you're coming from, and you have a chance to actually support the argument that's going on in the back of your head.
Yeah. And I will say again, I think it's totally fair to be horrified by that. That is horrible. No notes. Just, that's not the only time this is happening. So notes, that was my note. Sorry.
Monica, I'm really glad that you finally wrote this article. I've kind of thought, I wonder if we're going to do a podcast about this at some point. For the last couple of years, I kind of hoped this argument would go away, and it hasn't. So I'm glad that we're talking about it now. I'm glad that we were able to talk about it in the way that we have and kind of spending as much time steel manning as we can. I think that's the appropriate way to kind of deal with whether it's the pro-life side or the pro-choice side making claims. But if I want pro-life people to be thought of as people who think well. And so let's try to be extra careful with the claims that we're making and the research that we're doing and the arguments that we're making, so that when we're making arguments that are persuasive, they're also true, and vice versa. That's what we would like. So, Monica, you're awesome. Thanks for being on. We've got another episode we're going to be doing with you. You're probably just going to be one of the most regular people on our podcast, and that's completely fine with all of us. So, thanks to the rest of you for watching, for listening. We're going to have links in the notes for all of the different things that we talked about, or at least as many things as I can find.
We'll get you the fish study. That's the thing.
Get me the fish study. I'm literally going to start with fish study, and then it's going to be a link to a PDF or something so that everyone can find the fish study. Monica, you're awesome. Thanks for coming on with us.
Thanks for having me.